This year marks the 100th anniversary of the first and only plenary council of Chinese bishops, held in Shanghai in May and June of 1924. The history of Christianity, and the Catholic Church in particular, in China, is a long and winding road, an appropriately complicated story for such an ancient and sophisticated culture. Scott and I travel down some of those twists and turns during this episode on Tinshu Jiaowei, the Catholic Church in China.
God bless America.
God love you. I want these to be my first words of greeting to you. They will be the concluding words on each broadcast.
I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president.
Annuncio optis gaudium magnum. Habemus papam.
You've embarked on a Catholic history trek.
Although much missionary activity in Asia has occurred in the modern era, the past 400 years or so, the history of Christianity in China actually goes back almost 1,500 years. Western Christians, such as Roman Catholics like us, tend to forget that in its earliest days Christianity spread east just as much as it spread west. Armenia is generally considered to be the first Christian nation. The faith was strong in places like Syria and Iraq, and missionaries made inroads early on in Persia and India. The churches in many of these places were separated from the church led by Rome in the course of the Christological controversies of the 5th century, which is part of the reason they don't get much attention in histories of the church that center on Catholicism. But the Church of the East, or the Nestorian Church, continued to thrive and to evangelize for centuries afterward. In the city of Xi'an in central China is a stela, a carved stone pillar, that tells of the presence of Persian monks belonging to the Syrian Church in the 600s. By the 800s, there were 3,000 Christian monks in China. But in the last days of the Tang dynasty in the early 9th century, foreign religions were banished. This included Buddhist and Christian monks. The monks had made few converts among the Chinese people, and their impact was therefore fleeting. At the end of the first millennium, Christianity had all but disappeared from the Middle Kingdom. Yet Syrian Christianity had made some inroads among tribes on the outskirts of China, including the Mongols, who would come to dominate the region in the Middle Ages.
In the mid and late 13th century, Franciscan missionaries began to arrive in China, which at the time was the land of the Tartars, and under Mongolian control. Pope Nicholas IV, the first Franciscan pope, sent fellow friar Giovanni di Montecorvino to the east. During the Yuan dynasty, the Emperor Kublai Khan had opened the empire to Christianity. Giovanni set out in 1289. His route took him from Italy to Persia to India before finally reaching China in 1294. But he did not get the chance to convert Kublai Khan, who had just recently died. But his successor Timur Khan did allow the Franciscans to preach, although this emperor did not embrace Christianity himself. The biggest opposition to the Franciscans did not come from the pagan emperors, but from the schismatic Nestorians. We know of the missionary work of Giovanni and Montecorvino and his fellow Franciscans through the surviving letters which were sent back west. We have some of these letters from Giovanni and several others sent by fellow Franciscans, Brother Peregrine and Brother Andrew of Perugia. In these letters, Giovanni explained how he made 6,000 converts, but could have made many more if it were not for the Nestorians spreading false accusations against the Franciscans. He also described how he spent 12 years with the emperor and was allowed to sit on his court as a legate for the pope, but failed to convert him from his idolatry. He also tells of building churches and being joined by Brother Arnold of Cologne and translating the New Testament and Psalms into the Tartar language. One interesting bit from his second letter is Giovanni's account of how he bought 40 pagan boys who he baptized and instructed in singing the psalms and hymns and praying the divine office. I'm not entirely sure what is meant by buying the boys, if they were being sold as slaves or if that's figurative. Regardless, another interesting bit regards King George, an Nestorian convert who took minor orders and joined in Giovanni's missionary works. In this letter, George is described as being of the family of Prester John. Prester John, the mythical or historical Christian ruler from the East, deserves his own episode. In the early 14th century, Pope Clement V sent 7 Franciscans to consecrate Giovanni as an archbishop and then to serve as his suffragan bishops. Only 3 of these 7 survived the trip. 2 of them, Peregrine and Andrew of Perugia, sent letters describing the successes of Giovanni and King George, their struggles with the Nestorians, the many converts among the idolaters, and how the Franciscans were free to preach. Ultimately, 242 Franciscans would go to China, including a dozen who became bishops. But the Franciscan missions and the freedom to openly preach would end in 1368, when the Ming Dynasty seized control, and by the end of the 14th century, Christianity effectively disappeared in East Asia, at least temporarily.
The next wave of Catholic activity occurred in the era of the Catholic Reformation. In 1552, the celebrated missionary Francis Xavier, who had labored so successfully in India and Japan, died on the island of Sanshan off the coast of China while awaiting passage to the mainland. Xavier's Jesuit confreres would pick up in spectacular fashion where he had left off. In the centuries since the Franciscan expeditions Scott described, Western Christianity had been split by the Reformation. So as we pick up the story, we refocus on Roman Catholicism, though there would be Protestant missionaries as well. The reintroduction of the Catholic faith into China dates from 1555. In that year, a Jesuit spent 2 months in Guangzhou, a city in South China not far from Hong Kong and Macau, and a Dominican, Gaspar de la Cruz, preached boldly but ineffectively in the same city. According to his own account, my strange physical appearance and my dress drew the attention of a large crowd who blocked the streets. They always listened to my words attentively and asked me some questions. Gaspar was arrested and expelled from the country, an inauspicious but predictable beginning to the modern mission period. But China could not delay forever an encounter between the growing restive nations of Europe and the isolationist Chinese homeland. From the 16th century on, Spanish and Portuguese imperialists actively sought to establish colonies in China, and Jesuits, Franciscans, and Dominicans sought to evangelize the Chinese. Portugal established a base at Macau, and Spanish missionaries were launched from the empire's Asian colony in the Philippines. While he was not the only missionary in China during the period, the Jesuit Matteo Ricci is certainly the best known. When Ricci arrived in Macau in 1582, his fellow Italian Jesuit Michael Ruggieri had already been there for 3 years and had made progress in the arduous process of learning the Chinese language and culture. He had translated the 10 Commandments into Chinese and written several catechetical works. For the next 28 years, Ricci labored in China, ingratiating himself with the elite and striving with care and tact to convey the gospel message in a culture secure in its own religious traditions. To note just one example of the complexity of this engagement, Ricci at first dressed as a Buddhist monk, thinking this was the closest analog to his own vocation as an ordained priest. But a Confucian scholar he befriended recommended that he assume the appearance of a scholar, which would reflect Ricci's learning and gain him greater respect among Chinese leaders. Many images of Ricci that you see online depict him in this scholarly garb. Using his knowledge of Western sciences, math, astronomy, geography, Ricci gained an audience with Chinese political and social leaders, and using his profound knowledge of Confucian and Buddhist religious thought, he both highlighted the similarities to Christianity so as to show how the ancient Chinese religions pointed to fulfillment in Christ, and also explained the differences so as to demonstrate the need for the Chinese to embrace the gospel. It was a project for centuries, not days, and Ricci and his collaborators made only small numbers of converts, though that was a success in the challenging Chinese environment. Ricci also accomplished a rare feat, obtaining access to the imperial capital of Beijing, where he dwelt from 1601 until his death in 1610. Although the Chinese church would rely heavily until the late 20th century on Western missionaries, Ricci and his fellow evangelists had laid the foundation for a native Chinese Catholicism. Among their converts were the men who have been called the 3 great pillars of Chinese Catholicism. Paul Zhu Guanqi was born in Shanghai in 1562 and embarked on a distinguished career as a scholar of the empire. He came to know several Jesuits, including Matteo Ricci, and after close study of Christian texts, requested baptism in 1603, taking his Christian name, Paul. He converted much of his family to Catholicism as well. He collaborated with Ricci in Beijing, helping to translate scientific works into Chinese. He wrote several books on Christianity, and his home in Shanghai became the headquarters for a convert community of 200 Chinese. It remains a hub of Catholic activity today. Xu Guangqi made important contributions to Chinese science and agriculture and was a trusted advisor to the Ming Dynasty through its closing years. Dying in 1633, he remained an honored figure in Shanghai even through the communist period. The Guangqi Garden in that bustling city is a monument to the great man. Li Zhikao was a close friend of Paul Xu Guangqi. Born in 1565 in Hangzhou, he also became an elite government official. In the capital of Beijing, he became acquainted with the Jesuits and attracted to their scientific proficiency. He asked for baptism, but was told he must first separate from his concubine, which he was unwilling to do. During a grave illness, Li pledged to live as the fathers demanded if he recovered. He was tended in his illness by Father Ricci, who was himself frail and would not long survive. Li made a full recovery, and upon Ricci's death in 1610, he arranged for the priest's burial and secured the Jesuits a grant of land for a cemetery. In the 1620s, he helped to interpret and promote the recent discovery of the Xi'an stela, which transformed the previous assessment of Christianity as a foreign or imperialist religion. It had in fact been present in China for almost 1,000 years. Li Zhikao died in Beijing in 1629, with Paul Guangqi and Jesuit priests at his side. Li Zhikao brought another Hangzhou scholar to the faith, Yang Tingyun. Like Li, Yang's non-marital relationship was an obstacle to baptism. The following is a historical account of an exchange between Yang and his friend Li Zhikao on this difficulty. The Western Fathers are really strange. I, with my power as censor, am serving them, so why is it not possible? Can they not just allow me to have one concubine? I do a lot for them in my capacity as censor. Why is it that they will not allow me to have one concubine? It would not have been the case with Buddhist followers. Li Zhikao sighed and said, "By this you know the Western Fathers really cannot be compared to Buddhist followers. The commandments of the West were promulgated by God and observed by the saints of former times. To observe them is virtue. Go against them and you will be punished. The difference between virtue and punishment is very clear. If you only pander to your whims, what then of the commandments? The Fathers think of saving men. They do not want to be praised themselves. They want to abolish worldly concern, but do not dare to transgress religious laws. That's the position of the Fathers. Their virtue is complete and full. You know that you have failed, but you do not change. What's the benefit, then, in following it?" Yang was convinced by Li's argument and became a Christian. After his conversion, Michael Yang Tingyun founded a charitable society to help those in need. While breaking clearly with Buddhism, he also strove to explain Christian theology in terms that would resonate with the Buddhist tradition. When he died in 1627, he was in the process of building a church and residence for the Jesuits in Hangzhou, the capital of the eastern province of Zhejiang. The foundation provided by the 3 pillars of the Chinese Church was built upon by subsequent generations. One important figure was the granddaughter of Paul Xu Guangqi, Candida Xu. Candida was born in 1607, a few years after the baptism of her grandfather, and she was raised as a Catholic by her pious mother, praying a daily rosary. At 16, she was married to a non-Christian, a common practice in China where believers were so few. The couple had 8 children together, and through her good example, Candida's husband was eventually baptized at age 44. He died just 2 years later, so Candida would live as a widow for the next 40 years. She organized an embroidery shop with friends and family, and through this work raised funds to support the upkeep of priests and the building of churches throughout China. She was also generous to the poor of Shanghai, undertaking many works of mercy and promoting the gospel among the people. She has been called the most influential Chinese woman of the 17th century, and her faith has endured through her children and her impact on her community. According to Jean Charbonnier, in his History of Christians in China, the great Catholic families of Shanghai have remained faithful in spite of everything, and their faith expresses itself today in devotions, publications, and a great variety of good works, just as it had done in the 17th century. While all the missionaries of China demonstrated heroic courage and perseverance, unfortunately they didn't always cooperate harmoniously. In particular, differences between the Jesuits on one hand and the Dominicans and Franciscans on the other erupted in the mid-1600s into an acrimonious controversy that had long-lasting effects. The general question was to what extent traditional Chinese religious ideas could be adopted into Christian theology. The most contested specific question was whether converts must abandon as superstition the Confucian practice of venerating family ancestors. The Propaganda Fide, the Vatican congregation overseeing missions, ruled in favor of the opponents in 1645, banning ancestor worship for Catholics. But the same congregation reversed that decision 11 years later, vindicating the Jesuits. The controversy raged on in both China and Europe for decades. In 1704, the Pope again banned the ancestor rites. That was the position in force until the 20th century, when the Vatican began to stress the need for enculturation and the transition from foreign missions to native clergy and episcopal leadership. Pope Pius XII took a more lenient position on ancestor rites, and this view was affirmed by the Second Vatican Council. The Vatican's strictures against Confucian practices reinforced existing Chinese antipathy toward Christianity as a foreign religion. Through the 18th and early 19th centuries, the faith survived, but often in the face of discrimination and persecution. Native priests such as Andrew Lee continued to provide sacraments, and native catechists such as Peter Wu Guosheng and Zhang Dapen from Guizhou province in southwest China bolstered the faith among fellow Catholics and converted others. They were both killed for their beliefs and were among the 120 Chinese martyrs canonized by Pope John Paul II in the year 2000.
In the late 8th century, British traders, by way of the East India Company, began smuggling and selling opium in China. Due to the social and economic tragedies following the opium trade, just like problems with the opioid crisis in modern times, the Beijing court banned the imports. And in 1839, the Chinese arrested opium traders, confiscated and destroyed large quantities of opium, and a senior official even wrote to Queen Victoria decrying the British efforts at poisoning the Chinese people with the drug, which he likened to a death trap. He pointed out how the British recognized its harm and prohibited opium in their own country, and therefore shouldn't be bringing it into China. Britain's response? She invaded China. Working alongside the opium traders, the British sent a fleet of warships and battalions of soldiers. Dubbed the First Opium War, Britain overwhelmed China and forced the lopsided Treaty of Nanjing, in which China ceded control of the island of Hong Kong, among other concessions. Over the next 60 years, just about every colonizing power would invade China, and by the end of the 19th century, France, Russia, Japan, the Netherlands, Belgium, and even America had invaded and signed treaties with China. In these treaties, China lost vassal states, conceded territory, and paid compensation. Another result of these treaties was allowing freedom for Christian missionaries to evangelize. But anti-foreign sentiment remained strong. In the late 1850s, a second Opium War erupted. China was again defeated and signed a new round of treaties with countries like Britain, France, Russia, and the US. Not only did Christianity threaten the traditional values of imperialism and Confucianism, but it was also associated with these invading foreigners. So Beijing secretly encouraged provincial officials to continue to prohibit Christianity, despite the treaties, which led to anti-Christian riots in the Tianjin Massacre of 1870. The sentiment would resurface at the turn of the century with the Boxer Rebellion. This rebellion was named for the Chinese militants' use of a form of Eastern martial arts, which the Westerners called boxing. At first, the Boxers targeted Christian converts, then foreign missionaries, and ultimately all things foreign. Seen as a way to unshackle herself from foreign domination, the Imperial government began to support the rebellion, which prompted the foreign powers to send troops who seized Beijing and brought an end to the rebellion. The Boxers killed about 30,000 Christians in China before the rebellion was defeated. In 1911, dissatisfaction with the imperial government led to groups of nationalists and revolutionaries overthrowing the ruling monarchy and creating the Republic of China. Despite the regime change from imperial to republic, Christian missionaries continued to evangelize in large numbers. In 1926, Pope Pius XI consecrated 6 Chinese priests as bishops, but China's toleration of Christians would not continue indefinitely.
The Chinese Republic that, as Scott noted, rose out of the ruins of the Qing dynasty, was unstable. President Sun Yat-sen's military chief had imperialist aspirations, and he left a divided nation in his wake. After World War I, the country descended into civil war, which eventually turned into a contest between the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, led by Mao Zedong. The communists finally secured control in 1949, and the nationalists fled to the island of Taiwan. With the communist takeover, the church entered a period of persecution. Foreign missionaries were systematically banished, imprisoned, or executed. Among the many remarkable stories of this period is that of Bishop James Walsh. A Maryland native, Walsh was one of the earliest priests of the new Maryknoll Missionary Order, ordained in 1915. Walsh was one of 4 priests who composed the first band of Maryknoll missionaries to go to China. In 1927, he was consecrated Bishop of Kongmun, and he chose as the site of his episcopal ordination the island of Sanshan, where his hero, Francis Xavier, had died. In 1948, he was coordinating all missionary activity from Shanghai. 2 years after the communists took control, they shut down the Catholic Central Bureau in Shanghai. Walsh was urged to leave China, as most foreign priests and other missionaries did, but he refused. "I think it should simply be regarded as a normal risk that is inherent in our state of life," he wrote, "and as a small price to pay for carrying out our duty, much as in the case of firemen and policemen who are sometimes required to give their lives. Moreover, I think such an eventuality would be a privilege because it would associate us a little more intimately in the cross of Christ." Arrested in 1958, Walsh spent 12 years imprisoned in isolation. Suddenly, in 1970, he was released as a goodwill gesture by the Chinese government during a thaw in Sino-American relations. He walked across a bridge into freedom in Hong Kong. Bishop Walsh retired to the Maryknoll House in New York, where he died in 1981. Another prominent figure from the Communist era was Cardinal Ignatius Kung Pin Mei, often known simply as Cardinal Kung. Ignatius Kung was consecrated the first Chinese bishop of Shanghai in 1949, the same year the Communists took power. He continued to lead Shanghai Catholics in practicing their faith in the face of communist persecution, and in 1955 he was arrested along with 200 priests and lay leaders from the region. When he was threatened and forced to address a crowd to confess his non-existent crimes, he instead shouted into the microphone, "Long live Christ the King! Long live the Pope!" Bishop Kung spent 30 years in prison, during which he was made a cardinal in pectore, that is, in secret, by Pope John Paul II. After Kung's release in 1988, his cardinalate was made public, and he retired to the U.S., where he died at age 98 in the year 2000. 7 months before John Paul II canonized the Martyrs of China. Under Deng Xiaoping, who led China from 1978 to 1989, Chinese society and its economy were liberalized to some degree, and religion shared in this loosening of restrictions. But this has been anything but consistent. The government has continued to seek control of Catholicism through the state-run Chinese Patriotic Association, which has been largely in an adversarial relationship with the so-called underground church, Catholics who have remained faithful to the Pope and refused to collaborate with the regime. So relations between the state and the church in China remain highly problematic, as Scott will explain.
As quoted by Our Lady of Fatima, Russia will spread its errors throughout the world, raising up wars and persecutions of the church. Relations between the church and those spreading these errors have always been highly problematic, and the Chinese Communist Party is no exception. In 2016, serial predator Cardinal Theodore McCarrick said of China, "I see a lot of things happening that would really open many doors, because President Xi and his government are concerned with the same things that Pope Francis is concerned about." I suppose that should be troubling, as the Chinese president is not concerned with evangelizing the gospel of Jesus Christ, nor saving men's souls. And if the cardinal says his goals and the Pope's goals are aligned, well, I'm not quite sure how to read that. Regardless, after McCarrick made at least 8 trips to China, in 2018 a provisional agreement was made between the Vatican and the Chinese Communist Party. While the details of the agreement have been kept secret, its effects have been public. Since then, Pope Francis lifted the excommunications of 8 bishops in the Communist Chinese Patriotic Association, and even forced legitimate underground bishops to step down to be replaced by the communist bishops. In one case, When the communist bishop replaced a Catholic bishop, the newly appointed communist bishop promptly led 33 of his diocesan priests to indoctrination courses at the Chinese Communist Party's Central Institute of Socialism. Despite the Vatican's concessions in this secret agreement, the Chinese have not recognized the 30 or so underground bishops who each have been pressured to sign a pledge of independence from the Vatican and to register with the Communist Catholic Patriotic Association. If they were to sign such an agreement, Cardinal Zen has pointed out it would equate to apostasy, which explains why many of the legitimate bishops have refused to sign this pledge, despite incarceration, isolation, abuse, and attempted indoctrination. Since the agreement was signed, the Chinese have also continued to aggressively surveil, censor, and demolish Catholic churches, arrest underground priests, ban Catholic youth groups, require sermons include inspiration from President Xi's sayings, and purge religious symbols like crosses from churches. The agreement has also seemingly kept the Vatican silent on China's detention of underground priests, genocidal arrests and forced labor for 1 million Uyghurs, and violent crackdowns against pro-democracy protesters. Unsurprisingly, this Vatican-Chinese agreement has been received with much criticism. It's often denounced as selling out the Catholic Church in China and betraying the faithful Catholics. Perhaps the most notable of the many critics is Cardinal Zen, who has labeled it as imprudent, engendering more pain and confusion, something that will kill our church, and blatantly evil and immoral because it legitimizes a schismatic church. Speaking of Joseph Zen, he escaped mainland China, fleeing from Shanghai to Hong Kong after the communist takeover, and then in 1961 was ordained a priest in the Salesian order. Then in 2002, he became Bishop of Hong Kong, and in 2006 was named a cardinal by Pope Benedict XVI. He's been an outspoken supporter of democracy, human rights, and religious liberty, and was recently arrested for his involvement in the 2019 pro-democracy demonstrations in Hong Kong. Another Catholic arrested in the wake of these 2019 demonstrations was Jimmy Lai, who converted to the church and was baptized in 1997 by then Father Joseph Zen. Like Zen, he escaped mainland China. Lai smuggled himself out in the bottom of a fishing boat to flee the Great Chinese Famine, which is said to have killed tens of millions of Chinese through the implementation of communist policies, similar, I guess, to Stalin's implementation of communism in Russia 3 decades earlier, which starved millions. Lai arrived in the British colony of Hong Kong, worked his way up from poverty, started a successful retail clothing line, a popular magazine called Next, and a popular newspaper, Apple Daily. His publications have both been highly critical of the Chinese communist policies and officials, and in 2020, the government arrested him and shut down Apple Daily. He's been jailed ever since and is currently being prosecuted in a show trial on charges of sedition and collusion with foreign governments. During his imprisonment, his public statements have often referred to his Catholic faith. The past 1,500 years has been, and continues to be, an interesting trek for the Tianju Jiaohui, or Catholic Church, in China. They can certainly use our prayers. And while you're praying for them, Kevin and I are always appreciative of your prayers for us, or our podcast. But if you're not the praying type, we also accept donations. You can find us on PayPal. And leaving a rating, subscribing, and sharing the podcast with others also helps us out. And speaking of prayer,
for our closing prayer, we welcome a special guest, the wife of my godson, who will be reciting the Hail Mary in Chinese. Molly grew up in the United States, but is a native of China and spent a year there as an adult. She'll begin with the sign of the cross, followed by the Ave Maria, ending with the sign of the cross again.
应福己自己，生圣之名，阿们。万福玛利亚，你充满圣宠，主与你同在，你在妇女中受赞颂，你的亲子耶稣同受赞颂。天主圣母玛利亚，求你现在和我们临终时， 为我们罪人祈求，天主，阿门。因父及子及圣神之名，阿门。
Thank you for listening to Catholic History Trek. You can reach us at catholichistorytrek@gmail.com.